Today is April 30th, and we are at the Randolph-Macon Library for part of the Living Legacies Oral History Project. Our guest today is Dr. Henry Edward York from the class of 1950. Also here today are Lori Preston, Sarah Hendricks, and Mrs. York. And my name is Judy Showalter. Thank you for coming in today and being a part of our project.
My pleasure, thank you.
Your family has a long history with Randolph-Macon. Can you tell us how that started?
Well, my father and two uncles attended Randolph-Macon back in the 1900s, early 1900s. My grandfather was a Methodist minister, so that we had the relationship with Methodist school, obviously. And Methodist minister sons got a special financial break to come to Randolph-Macon. They all had to work their way through school because the Methodist minister did not make very much income in those days. But both my uncle and my father's college careers were interrupted by World War I. But they've always had a very strong attachment to Randolph-Macon. My uncle, we called him Uncle Duck. His proper name was Arthur, but he was a trustee of the Randolph-Macon system. At the time, you had all of the Randolph-Macon institutions in one trusteeship. And when they split up, he went with the academy at Front Royal.
Is he James Arthur?
James Arthur, correct. You're exactly right, yes.
He's listed as James in the alumni directory.
Well, he was Uncle Duck to us. Now, nobody knows where nicknames come from. But when I was just turned 17, I had graduated from high school. Virginia had 11 years in the public schools in those days. And it was 1946. And my dad says, literally, get in the car. We're going to go over and register you for Randolph-Macon. There was none of this business of checking out colleges and seeing what was the best. You just went to college. My brother had come, older brother had come here, but he had been drafted. And in those days, you didn't get deferred in World War II. You were drafted and you went. And the college literally says you drop 2 classes and concentrate on these 2 for the next 2 weeks and take your final exams, and you get credit for that. So I come to Randolph-Macon as a freshman in 46, and one day my brother, in his uniform with a duffel bag, shows up at my room. He had gotten off a train in Ashland, not knowing where my father's assignment as a Methodist minister was, because conference met in those days in October. And he saw Dr. Simpson, who was dean, as he's coming across campus. And Dr. Simpson said, Mr. York, are you out of the service? And he says, yes, as of today. And he says, good, I'll register you for class. This is the last day you can get in for the fall. And he said, well, I haven't been home yet. And he says, I don't know where home is. And Dr. Simpson said, your father was sent back to the same church, so we know where your home is. You can call home. They'll bring you some clothes. You can take classes tomorrow. So he never even literally went home from being in the Army before he was back in school. But it saved him a whole year. He got a year ahead of his compatriots. So I was a student. My next older brother got out of the service. He came here. A younger brother 6 years later came here. I was here with one brother all my college career and 2 cousins for part of my college career here. So there were 4 York boys here most of the time. I think the Simpsons are the only ones that beat us with that.
There's a lot of Simpsons.
But we came to homecoming probably from then on. That was a family get-together. In the early days, we got a box lunch, and you sat around on the campus in groups of people to eat. We didn't have the fancy meals then, but it was a family tradition. None of my children came here, but one cousin's boy came here, and we now have, 2 of a cousin's daughter's stepchildren are here, I believe, at the present time. They're not Yorks, but they are part of the family. But Randolph-Macon has been very special to us. It's always been a very special place for us. That's an awful lot about a little thing, but
Well, with a father, with being a second generation, had you been here before?
and I don't think we'd ever been here before. My father had occasions to come because he would be coming to Richmond for meetings with the bishop or something, and he certainly knew Dr. Hatcher, who was the vice president for finance, who was a Methodist minister, and had served on some boards with him. So there was a connection. But travel to places like that was not very readily available if you go back into the 40s, early 40s. We were in the war years. Gas was limited. My dad was in the Army during that period of time, so he did have a little better transportation set up, but we didn't take vacations. You didn't go places because incomes were low and travel was limited. So as far as visiting the campus, I had never been here until I was a senior in high school. Yeah.
Can you tell us about that first trip to campus? Who did you meet? What did the buildings look like?
Well, since Dad knew everybody, I think it was a matter of going up to see Dr. Hatcher as the vice president and see Dr. Moreland. And, of course, campus was smaller, much smaller. Then we only had one dormitory, and the other one was being remodeled. Plus you had the old fraternity houses, the cottages. And some students actually lived in town because there were older couples that would rent a room or provide a room in order to have a young person in the house. And one of my best friends lived over where across from the gym, the football field now, in an area there. He lived with a family over there who wanted a young person to be in the household, so they provided a room. But the campus life, though, was a very important thing to us in those days. As students, we went to all the sports events. I won't talk about any of the other things they did, but we did go to all the sports events. Yeah.
We haven't heard a lot about Dr. Hatcher, who was here for so long.
Yes.
Could you tell us about Dr. Hatcher?
His daughter was the alumni secretary, Gertie. Gertrude Sloan, and everybody knew Gertie. She would probably be the Barclay of her day, because everybody came to see her when they came back on campus. Dr. Hatcher was a small person. He was always businesslike as far as I knew him. I don't think we had the relationship with faculty members that students have today. It's a much closer relationship. We got very close perhaps to our advisor, but we never got on a first name basis. We never got on a pal basis. One of my jobs was working with Dr. Bullington, who was the biology professor, and he collected lampreys in the spring. He had lampreys are the long eel-like things that they use in the biological labs. And he would hire us to go out and help him net these lampreys and then inoculate them with formaldehyde. And he'd ship them off to the biological laboratories. And that was, I think, $1. We were paid to do something like that. But
where did you collect them?
There were some of these streams that led into the river, and they would come up there, I guess, to spawn. I never really studied lampreys, but I can smell the formaldehyde to today. And I can walk into a building and say, I know exactly what that is. But a couple of professors had Dr. McConnell had a farm, and he'd hire people to harvest his corn. And I think the big thing was you got a chicken dinner out of it if you worked for him. Uh-huh.
I think our students would work for a chicken dinner now.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But I had told Sarah, I don't know whether that she had mentioned to you, but I had told her how the York Scholarship got started, and I didn't know whether you wanted that or not. My uncle, second uncle, was head of the health program, medical program at Princeton University, and he was quite a golfer. And the president of the university would always call on him when he had a cold or anything to give him shots of vitamin C or whatever. So they were on a first-name basis, and he got a call one day that the president and one of the trustees wanted to play golf. And the second trustee needed a partner. So would he come play golf with them? And, of course, when the president says, would you play golf? I guess he's found time to do it. So this one trustee, my recollection was he was with one of the big banks. I don't remember which one, but they were playing along, and my uncle said to him, do you give any tips on the market? And he says, I never give tips. But they beat the president and the other trustees, so he says, well, buy Union Carbide. So my uncle decided, well, if you're getting a tip from the horse's mouth, that might be a good investment. So he took $5,000, which was probably a lot of money for him, and he bought some Union Carbide stock. Didn't think too much about it. He's noticed it was going up, and 2 years later, the same thing happened. The president says, Dr. York, Mr. So-and-so is here, and he wants you as his partner to play golf. And again, they beat the president and the other trustee. And so the gentleman said to him, if you bought that Union Carbide, now's a good time to sell it. He actually doubled his $5,000. So what he did is he took his half and invested in something he felt was very conservative. And he says, I've got this play money. And what I'll do with it is I'll play with it all my life, and when I pass away, it'll go to Randolph-Macon as a scholarship. And the letter, I brought you a copy of that letter for your files here. And it says, I wish, it was a great pleasure that my husband, Dr. Wilbur H. York, planned in his bequest of $100,000 to Randolph-Macon. He wished to establish a scholarship in memory of the three York brothers, Charles, Arthur, and Wilbur, who entered Randolph-Macon with the class of 1916. All three retained their interest in the college as long as they lived, and their 6 sons followed them, et cetera, et cetera. So this was play money, literally, for him. And since it did quite well, it started that scholarship, which we hope the market will go back up on. Yeah. But I thought that was really one of those unique little stories of how things happen there. And he's never considered that his money. He said, that money's Randolph-Macon money. All my life it'll be Randolph-Macon's money. And
About the scholarship, it is pre-ministerial or pre-medical?
Pre-medical, yes. I think they said the first emphasis would be pre-ministerial. I don't remember exactly, but since 2 of them went into medicine and 1 went into the ministry,
okay, that's
that's
what I was wondering.
Yeah.
The young woman who has it now is headed to Duke Divinity School now.
Yeah, I noticed that. That's great. That's really good. And one of the reasons I was asking about the working situation in the library and other places is that I have a great philosophy that people who have to work to get their education certainly appreciate it a lot more. I'm not sure we do better in the process of getting it, but we certainly appreciate it. And this is the one reason we've been trying to support that same scholarship fund is with our yearly contribution, because I think that it's more difficult for youngsters today. We could get by very easily with nothing. We weren't used to anything. I personally had a problem when our children came old enough to get allowances, because I said to Betty, you've got to decide what the allowances are, because I don't know anything about allowances. But I think children today have grown up not knowing what it is to do without things. We grew up in an age when nobody had things. I never heard any discussion of money until the day before I came to campus. I thought I was going to get the boy-girl talk, I want you to come out on the porch and sit with me. I want to talk to you. And I thought, well, I know about the birds and bees. I don't know anything else, but I know about birds and bees. But it was actually money. You're going to school, and I have war bonds that will cash in to help you, but it's a loan because that's our retirement. That's not easy to say today to people because things are totally different, I think.
Well,
Again, I'll ad lib, so you got to.
Well, but that takes us back to your Randolph-Macon experience. Now, you had some help because your father was a Methodist
Right. There was,
minister.
I think, a 10% or something tuition help. And if you had brothers here, there was some additional help or another sibling. I think Dr. Hatcher, being a minister, said, well, we have some jobs, and the best one is working in a cafeteria because you get your room and board or a good bit of that covered with that. And certainly, I worked there for 4 years. And I was telling this to somebody recently, said, oh, but that took so much time. Well, if you work during meals, you're there at the time you normally are not doing things. And because I was the first one put into there, as the years go by, I sort of ran the little group of people, and we worked 2 meals a day.
That's what I was going to ask. Did you
two-
have to work every meal?
No, you worked 2
Wow.
meals a day. But it got to the point where I think we had 6 or 8 working each meal, and I could say, well, why don't you go on and eat? Because there's no big crowd. We didn't basically do anything other than we served, which you probably, I don't know whether they can do that today, use students to serve, but we didn't have to go through health department or anything. But we'd be on the serving line, keep the milk, because again, we poured glasses of milk. You didn't have bottles or things, and we filled the dessert dishes out of big cans of peaches. You would be filling the dishes right there, things that probably you couldn't do today. But the students mostly returned their trays. It was a matter of just keeping tables clean. And so if there was a slack in the line, I could say, well, one of you go ahead and eat. So you actually were eating on your working time, so it wasn't like you were losing a lot of time.
Now, Randolph-Macon has had an unfortunate history with cafeterias. Where was the cafeteria?
It was a brand new building because up to that year the students were fed in boarding houses. And the older students coming back had a choice. They could go back to their boarding house, and I say coming back, they were military coming back. They could go back to the boarding house, or they could start in the cafeteria. It was in that little building right where the entrance to the stadium is there, the building on that little corner across from the old gym. I don't know
The
what
annex. We call it the annex now.
Yes,
but
the annex building. Okay. All right. Actually, we had an interesting little thing because Sunday, we had big dinner on Sunday, and we had bag lunches for Sunday supper. And everybody complained about bologna sandwiches and peanut butter cookies and an apple for their supper. But because we were handing out the bags, and there were not as many students there for dinner on Sunday as for most meals, there'd be 100 bags of lunch bags left over. Well, they couldn't use them. I think all the help took a couple of them home, but so the boys working there would always grab 5 or 6 of them. Well, I was living in the fraternity house, and the very people who complained said, "Did you bring any extra sandwiches with you?" Because I think the problem is when you talk about, because I was a principal for 28 years, and then I was dean at Marymount University, and I would hear kids complaining more at the university than at the school. They'd complain, and I go through the line at the university because I was teaching graduate classes, and I'd be there in the evening, so you ate as part of your contract if you were teaching an evening class. And there would be choice of 3 entrees. It'd be baked chicken or shrimp or beef. And there would be the salad bars and the dessert bars. And the kids are going over for their dinner and getting a bowl of cereal. And they're complaining. And I had a group of them come to me as the dean, and they were the undergraduates, which I always enjoyed working with because they were so naive in many ways. And, and they come in complaining about the food. And I said, you know, this is interesting. How many entrees does your mother put on the table when she cooks dinner at home? And they said, well, we only have one meat. And I said, but you have 3 choices here. Now here, if it was liver night at Randolph-Macon when I was in school and you didn't like liver, tough, because there isn't any other choice. But I think part of the problem is that young people have grown up eating out a lot when they had choices at a restaurant. And if you're limited to 3 choices in a cafeteria, it must be a tough world.
What was a typical meal like? What did it include?
Well, I mentioned liver. Usually, on a Thursday night, liver, you would have some starch like a potato or mashed potatoes. There would be a vegetable. We possibly had salads and a dessert, and I'm trying to picture the line, but there was a little like sunken space on the serving area for that section, and there would be milk glasses, and one of the boys would be pouring milk out of a large container, and some kid would be dipping up peaches. Usually sliced peaches was one of the standard dessert, or applesauce. That would be a dessert. There was no, I don't recall ever having ice cream or anything like that. It was generally probably a very well balanced meal when you come down to it.
That would probably do away with the freshman 15.
Yeah. But once a year they would have steak, and they would probably be like a big rib steak of some kind. Probably weren't very tender, but one of the advantages of working is you always went back, and the cooks were all black cooks, good cooks, and you go back there and they'd say, Ted, pick your steak and we'll put them aside. And they were big pieces of beef, probably as tough as shoe leather, but you know.
But they seemed like a treat.
They
at the
seemed like a
time,
real
huh?
treat because we didn't get grilled steak, or I guess they were fried on a big surface like that. But they had bacon and eggs and pancakes and things like this but never a choice. It was always the one item. And I guess we were so used to that part and complaining about it at all.
Were there any places in town where students would go out?
Yes,
for
there
hamburgers?
was a place down on the highway, and I can't remember the name, but the lady Brandnett came to work at our cafeteria as assistant manager. And I know, but again, it was the GIs that had pocket money. It wasn't most of the rest of us. As a matter of fact, I was telling somebody recently, there were probably 38 people in my fraternity. 7 of us roomed in the fraternity house. There was one car, and that guy had been a major in the Air Force that had that car. Totally different. I don't remember more than a half a dozen people with cars on the campus. They just were not available to people. You used the train or the bus, or somebody came and picked you up. Of course, you hitchhiked quite a bit. But the one man that owned that car, if you wanted to go into Richmond on a Saturday, he took a dime up from about 8 people to get gas to go into Richmond. It wasn't a question, I'm going. It was a question, if you want to pay for the fuel, you can ride into Richmond. Movies were a quarter at the little local theater. They were 50 cents in Richmond, but they were 2 years earlier. But GIs, remember, got a monthly check, and they had to pay their bookstore, they had to pay their meals and things out of that. But they would often end up with $30 or $40 spending money, and that was not typical of most of us. You worked in the summer, and that's what you had to pay for your books and your spending money.
How much did it cost do you remember how much it cost for a year at Randolph-Macon?
my 4 years cost me $2,400 above what I got for working here. So I would say maybe $1,500, $1,200 a year would be the tuition, something like that. But you see, we didn't have all the extras that you have to have today. Dr. Davis, just past president of Shenandoah, was talking about Randolph-Macon, and he's a Randolph-Macon graduate. He's on the board, I think, at Randolph-Macon now. Was talking about the Brock Center and why universities had to have that type of facility. He said, we won't get students if we don't have it, because that's one of the first things they ask about. What do you have in the way of exercise, whether they use it or not? Just like he said, Shenandoah had to start a football team. He says, I fought it for years because it's a big cost to the university. But this is what potential students expect. But again, I made $200 a summer working at a summer camp. That took care of my textbooks, my fraternity dues, everything. Barclay was looking at my college ring, and she said, oh, that's nice. Do you remember what you paid for it? I said, my wife bought it for me on our 20th anniversary. And she figured out she paid $53 for it. And Barclay said, well, about $750 to $800 today. Now that shows
the big men's rings.
Shows you a difference in a men's college ring. I couldn't afford it. I did buy a little fraternity ring my senior year because I think it cost $10 or $15. It was gold, but it was. I figured I could afford that, and I had that much that I put aside. But we didn't have to have money. One of the things we would do on Sundays, take those bag lunches and walk down the railroad track. And my late brother had them. I think my younger brother now has them. Dad's albums for his college days, and it shows them walking the railroad track in the 1918s or 19s or whenever they were 16s. They walked the railroad track on Sunday afternoon, except they wore suits with hats on. We wore whatever we had.
Ted, you might want to share with them how you paid for yours.
Oh, well, I don't know. That's kind of personal, but Uncle Sam paid for mine because as soon as I graduated from high school, I was drafted into the Korean War. That's the third interruption, but it didn't interrupt my college. But fortunately, I just was not used to spending money, so I just kept sending money home because I wanted a car when I got out of service. And my dad banked it, and when I got home, he says, you've paid your college loan, and you have money. You want to buy my 3-year-old car, and great, no more buses, no more trains. I got a car now, which was great, yeah. But it was kind of interesting because I guess it was probably 15 years later, I got a check from my dad for $2,400. He said, this is the loan you gave me. He said, we decided we don't need it, and you paid back your college. So Betty and I decided we'd set up a credit union account for each of our 3 children to start their college fund, because college was getting more expensive. But part of that is we didn't have to have all these extras. We really didn't have to have them. It was.
And what activities did you participate in?
I never was a singer, so I couldn't be in the glee club. But I did participate in my first year on campus. I got drafted to be in the Randolph-Macon Players, and I did. We starred in Arsenic and Old Lace, and I remembered I was a little worried because I was one of the policemen, and I had to say, "What the hell?" And I was afraid my folks would come to see the play. But Hallie Chilton, who was one of the townies attending college, drafted me in to be in that. And I was just again a 17-year-old freshman. My best friend was about the same age, and we were going to be the two policemen in Arsenic Old Lace. And the night of the performance, and I told Hallie this about 3 years ago. A little story. She was there working behind the scenes, and she wasn't one of the two sisters in the play. But she had a skirt, and girls wore the long skirts and bobby socks and saddle shoes, and she had disappeared. And she came back, and we were standing ready to go on the stage, and she leans down and grabs her skirt and starts pulling it up. And, of course, here are these two kids looking at this gal about 3 years older than we were. Right, nice-looking gal, and she's pulling her dress up. Well, she had on blue jeans underneath it. And, of course, the girls wore the blue jeans rolled up to be almost shorts. And her mother would never allow her to wear blue jeans out of the house. So she had put a skirt on over top. And I told her that little story, and she said, I can tell you why I had to wear a skirt, because my mother would. I said, well, you shocked a couple of freshmen. Now, that shows how naive we were in those days. I mean, we really were not as informed as these kids are. I was very active. All the fraternities and the dormitories participated in intramurals. I don't know whether they still do this on a big deal now, but your East Wing would always have a team, and so we all had to play. This was just an understanding that you did this, and I don't remember. It was sort of like 90% of the students participated in intramurals. We played touch football. We played volleyball, basketball. I don't know that we had softball in those days, but we all played. I mean, they'd round you up and say it's time to play a game, which I think was very good. It was quite good for us. Again, I liked to play tennis. I was not good enough. One of my cousins was a tennis player. Jim was a tennis player, but I liked to play it. The only problem was Dr. Bowen, the Latin teacher, knew my parents quite well, and he would come to the fraternity house to get somebody to play tennis with him. Now, the problem was he cheated. Now, I don't think he did it deliberately, but these were clay courts. And I think I saw chalk go up on that ball, Mr. York. Or he would say that, and he wanted to play doubles, because even then he was pretty old and he couldn't move a lot. So you'd feel sorry for him, and you'd lob a serve and he'd drive it right down your throat. He still had his skills, he just couldn't move. But he wanted to play doubles, because you had to cover 2/3 of your court, because he couldn't move around. But he knew everybody. I have another little account that has always been very important to me. Dr. Terry, who was a Bible teacher, my first 9 weeks, in those days they posted the grades on the doors of the classroom by name, no Social Security or anything. And of course, the grades went home by mail. In those days, they mailed the grades home. And Dr. Terry stopped me down by the old gym and said, Mr. York, are you happy with your grades? Now, I didn't have him for class. I said, no, sir, I'm not very happy. He says, well, what does your father think about them? I didn't know he knew. He was a minister, so I didn't know that he knew my dad. But I said, well, I haven't heard yet. And then he said, do you have time to sit and talk with me? I said, Dr. Terry, I have all the time in the world. And he talked with me about an hour about how to study. And I never had problems with my grades after that. I was from I'd gone to 4 different high schools. And the last high school had 21 in the graduating class. I'd never written a formal paper till I got here. And, of course, you know what they looked like when they came back. There was more red on them than there was blue ink on them. I knew nothing about topic sentences, lead-in paragraphs, concluding sentence, none of that. And yet the people teaching this knew what good papers should be like. So I think the kids have a lot of more advantage on that now, because certainly throughout their schooling they know how to write. But my first formal paper was for an English class, freshman English class, and wow, that was quite an experience. But the fact that a professor that I didn't have was willing to take time to go over something, and do you rewrite your notes? Do you discuss things, ask questions to somebody? And so my friend and I started that. We would say, what do you think about so-and-so? How would so-and-so do this? And I liked history, so that was very easy to do that. And we had lots of good professors, believe it, that they really took an interest in their students.
What was your undergraduate major?
I was taking pre-law, thought I was going to be a lawyer. When I got out of service in November, you can't go into law school, and the local superintendent had a matter of fact, it was Ted Keller was going into the Marine Corps, and he said, I need somebody to take over Ted Keller's classes. So I said, well, I'll do that for the next semester. Then I'm going to law school. Well, I never left teaching that time. But 5 years later, I went to Fairfax High School and took the position that Ted Keller was leaving to come to Randolph-Macon. And I said, Ted, I know nothing about football. You got to stay there. I know nothing about football.
Can't follow him.
I cannot follow it. But my 4 years at Randolph-Macon were great years. I could say a small college, and I frequently would recommend to parents to pick a small college if a child particularly was one that was not very outgoing, not very, I don't mean aggressive, but extrovertish. I said if they go to the big university, the chances are they're not going to make it, because they're not going to get the care and attention that they would get at a smaller school, nor will they know how to get it. So I think the small school is a great thing there.
So after graduation, you went directly into the service?
I started to teach down at Clifton Forge, and I was there about a month and a half when Uncle Sam, I knew that this was coming. So Uncle Sam called me, and I was in the Army for 3 years and got out in November and started teaching school and stayed with education for 47 years.
What did you teach primarily?
I taught history until I became a principal, and I loved history. History was one of the subjects that many kids don't like, because it's basically been taught, memorized dates, places, names, and not the relationships. And I think if kids learn history through relationships, it doesn't matter what day a war started, but why did the war start? What were the results of it? I mean, we knew most wars started in the spring and ended in the fall because people have to go home. You can't fight in the winter, but why did that war start? Why did that, we could say today, why did the recession start? If you know those, it doesn't matter exactly what the date was. And I think that once kids learn that history repeats itself, and we can see these same things happening over and over again, and why. You don't have to be able to quote the dates in order to know what the people did. And that Churchill said, if you don't study history, you're going to repeat all the mistakes that people have made over and over again here. I've also taught a little biology and a little English, but my spelling is terrible. Good dictionary skills, though.
Right. Reference.
Yes.
Can you mention quickly, just talking about teaching, I think this is such a wonderful story that you mentioned earlier about what the the lesson you learned from the art historian who came to campus?
I use this. Betty and I have been docents at our local historical house, the founder of the city of Winchester from the 1700s, 1730s. And we now have a museum there which has a nice art collection. Julian Woodglass Jr. collected probably one of the nicest 18th century collections on the East Coast, American and European art. And we have school children come through and we try to get them. I mean, you can't only talk so much about furniture and silver and paintings to kids, but look at a painting and study it. And we have one painting, and I told Sarah if she'd take a little time, we'll take her over there and show her this house one of these days when she's up there. But there's a painting by Sir Thomas Lawrence of a lady by the name of Miss Thayer. She becomes Baroness Thibault. And this painting is perfect for this little story. And I use the painting. If you look at the painting, you will see a young lady with a dreamy look. And I asked a group of 17-year or 18-year-old high school kids about 10 years ago, what is Miss Thayer thinking about? And this one young lady, and I don't guess kids' age or girls' ages, boys, yeah, but girls, I would say she was 17. And she said, I think she's thinking about getting married. And it is a pre-wedding portrait. So she was right on the nose. And yet if you look at it, your eyes go immediately to this dreamy look. It's very unusual. It's not looking into the distance. It's really her mind is somewhere else. And I took my, at that time, 12-year-old grandson over to help me do some flower cutting. And I said, Stevie, I want to show you some things in the house. And I said, what's Miss Thayer thinking about? And he says, how much longer do I have to sit here? You know. So when I take a group through, I said, I want you to look at Miss Thayer. Now, Betty heard me say this, and she said, you don't remember this. I said, my senior year in college, I don't know who the teacher was. I'd have to go back and think about it. Might have been Dr. Webb, I don't know. He brought a visitor in to talk to our class, all men, boys. And I said, her name was Harriet Fitzgerald. And Betty says, you don't remember that from 50 years. You only saw her 1 hour. She asked this class, what is good art? And immediately we start showing our brilliance by brush strokes, technique, color, composition. She said, absolutely not. Good art is what you would put on the wall and look at for 50 years. Because you don't go by what the expert tells you is good art. You go by what you would appreciate. And she also said, but you can tell a good artist by you see immediately what the artist wanted you to see. And in Miss Thayer's case, it would be that dreamy look. She has a beautiful gown, but it's faint. She's got a ruby. And you go up and there's red lips and black eyebrows and black hair. And you're right there at that dreamy look. Your eyes go right up there. And if you look at most art, you can figure what the artist wants you to see. Well, Betty says, you didn't remember that name for 50-some years. I went on the internet. Harriet Fitzgerald was a New York artist, which I had remembered. But she also was the curator of art for Randolph-Macon Women's College. She was responsible for their art.
She was also on our board of trustees.
Yes, she was. That's why she was here. She was at a trustees meeting. But I had no way of really, other than I was so impressed. That's the only hour I ever had on art until I started volunteering at this museum where we have monthly training sessions and all. But she apparently impressed this 20-year-old kid.
Oh, I'm impressed. So how did you stay in contact with the college through these years?
Well, basically, my parents and uncles started this thing of coming to homecoming every year, and we would have a family get-together. We'd meet here at the campus. The men would probably go to the football game. I don't know what the women did. We'd stay down at the Green Palm or Palm Leaf Motel down there on Route 1 on the right-hand side going towards Richmond. they always put us in as far away from anybody else as they could. But probably wasn't much of a motel, I don't think. But then we would go into Richmond to, there was a chicken place on, what is that, Brook Road that where you cut off to go over to Chamberlain Ever. There was a chicken place over there, and they'd always put us in a back room for some reason. But there would be sometimes 20, 25 of us all there for get together. And it was a big occasion. We grew up fortunate, my family. We had relatives in New Jersey. My uncle, we had my other uncle, Arthur, was in Baltimore, and my grandfather was usually serving the church on the Eastern Shore or somewhere. So we could get together on my grandfather's birthday, and my mother's parents were in Clarendon, so it was a matter. And, holidays, people didn't rush in those days. You would take 2 or 3 days at Christmas to have family. So we were used to getting together. So homecoming was another occasion for us as a family to be together at Randolph-Macon here. It's always been important to me because I just think it does a wonderful job. I think that the school is great.
Those are all my questions. Anybody else?
You've mentioned a number of professors that were important to you. Are there any others that you'd like to
Well,
talk about?
people made fun of Dr. Moreland as president. They always called him 3 Point. But he had a habit that Betty says I picked up. He would pick up trash as he walked around the campus. She gets after me. She says, you haven't been a principal now for 20 years and you're still cleaning the malls. When we go to the mall, you're picking up trash. All of them, Dr. Simpson, who was the dean of faculty, and Dr. Gillette Simpson, who went on to marry Washington, was dean of students. I think I mentioned Dr. Bullington because I did take biology. When I came to campus, the library was where we registered for classes. And my freshman, your dad brought me, we went into the dormitory, he drops us off, goodbye, we'll see you at Thanksgiving, whatever. So I go into the library, and I'm sitting down at this table eventually with some faculty member, and he says, okay, what do you like? You have to take so much science in this. I like biology. I ended up in the full-year biology program instead of the one-semester freshman biology class, so I got to know Dr. Bullington real well. We had a little practice in those days. You couldn't join a fraternity until your second semester. You had to have your grades, and I assume that's pretty standard. But I quickly found out, because you could be pledged or pre-pledged, and I was a legacy since my brother was already in the fraternity. And I found out that the fraternities kept files of past exams. As a matter of fact, most professors gave out extra copies if you want to keep them. So my zoology semester, you had to learn the arterial and the vascular system of a frog. Now these are probably 100 Latin names for these things. You not only had to write them real neatly, but you had to memorize them. And I never was a good foreign language student, so I knew that I was lost. Because on the exam, there's an outline of the frog, and you either did the vascular or the arterial system. Well, that means there are only 50 if you knew which one. I went and looked at the files. Every other year, Dr. Bullington would do the arterial, the next year the vascular. Unfortunately, he forgot which year it was. I had studied the vascular system, which he had not asked for a whole year, and he asked for the arterial system. I could do about 5 of them. So I said, I'll just do the one I know. And my paper comes back from Dr. Bullington. York, you got an A on the question I didn't ask, but you got an F on the question I did ask. But I didn't have any. I didn't have any professors I didn't like. I guess I just assumed you were supposed to like. Generally, freshman English was taught by what we would call today a graduate student. They were instructors. I had Hasker, who was only here, I think, a year or two, but he put a lot of red marks on those papers. But I learned eventually how to do it.
Is that Dick Hasker who came back and taught here?
I can't remember what his first name was. I can't remember. He had a raspy voice is all I can remember.
Dr. Hasker taught English here for a really long time. I'll have to look and see if he was here before.
Dr. Webb, English teacher, of course Dr. Simpson taught English, and the other Dr. Simpson taught math. Had a very interesting thing on Dr. Simpson, the math teacher. He was also on the Manhattan Project, and in '46 they were still doing a lot of that. And occasionally he'd have to go up to New York or wherever they met. They had hired, because of the influx, they had hired a Mr. Robinson, a retired either John Marshall or T.J., I can't remember, math teacher, and he was to instruct freshmen in math. So he would take over Dr. Simpson's classes when Dr. Simpson would go away. Well, Dr. Simpson was, again, one of these very bright math people, and he literally wrote with one hand while he's erasing over here with the other hand. And freshman algebra was a lot more difficult than high school algebra. Mr. Robinson came in, but he had been used to teaching high school kids. So he's got the explanations for things pretty clearly. Well, 2 weeks later, Dr. Simpson comes back, and he's writing away. And one of these more brass GIs, the freshman GI, says, Dr. Simpson, I thought I understood this last week when Mr. Robinson was explaining it, but I'm lost. I just don't understand it. And I thought, oh, Lordy. Dr. Simpson puts the chalk down. He puts his eraser down. He walks out of the room. Well, you can talk about quiet. What's going to go on? Mr. Robinson comes in. He picks up the book, and he taught the rest of the semester. Nobody said a word. But all of a sudden, it was at a pace that we didn't want to stir up anything at that particular point. But Dr. Moreland, I respected him very well, and I think most people did. But to see him bending over and picking up paper, I think would cause some snickers. I had, when I was a principal, the man that did my yearbook at school also did the Randolph-Macon yearbook. He was the representative in the company. And he loved to come in the spring and show me the Randolph-Macon annuals because he was very proud of the work. And he didn't bring it in one spring. And I said, well, don't you have the Randolph-Macon annuals? And he said, yes, but I wasn't going to show it to you. And he said, I don't like it. And it was an interesting annual. It came out after the advisors ceased to have pretty much control over what was in an annual. They had all the faculty members as Mr. or Mrs., no titles, no rank. And he said, I tried to talk them about this, but they wouldn't listen to me. And he said, I don't like a bunch of 19, 20 years old taking away something that somebody has worked for years to get, a doctorate degree. And he says, at small schools, that's the thing they're really proud of, that they really have got the highest degree. And for some kid to say, this is Mr. And he says, okay, and he tried to take it back. And I said, no, I want to look through it. The picture of Dr. Moreland with Mr. Moreland, president, as I recall, had him, a counter picture, bending over, picking up trash from the backside. And he says...
Is that the one week? refer to as the butt book? Because
Yes.
there are many, many photos of bottoms.
And the picture of a lady, a
72.
girl at the football game with a square-cut peasant blouse leaning over opposite a pig with a litter.
That's the
That's
butt book.
72.
He says, I will not send this one to the, what is it, the collegiate competition or whatever, he said.
Yeah,
He's-
1972. We know
Now,
which one it
boy,
is.
that's a long time for me to remember that. But he says, I've always been so proud of my college annuals. But he said, this one is not something to be proud of.
That one doesn't add much to our understanding of the student experience that year.
No.
And between the newspaper and the annual, that's really our record of the students
Yes,
in archives.
yes.
And that year gives us no sense
No.
of that student experience because it's really just lots of pictures of student bottoms, not
Yeah.
students
We'll have-
doing anything.
We'll have to look because Dr. Moreland isn't president in 72.
That's true. It was a different one.
So
Now, maybe I've got two different stories mixed up, which is not hard to do at my stage of life, you have to understand. But I remember very much that maybe it was somebody else's backside that he
Well,
showed.
1972. It's really the students' reaction to going co-ed is
Yeah.
why there's all these bottoms in this book.
Yeah.
is-
And this disrespectful picture of this girl, I think, was, I mean, it just,
It's
I remember that one vividly. The backside, I could have been looking at somebody else because of Dr. Moreland's habit of bending over and picking up the trash, which he may not have been the only one that did it, but that's, I guess I wasn't the only one in school that did it either. Maybe in the malls, I'm not the only one, dear, that picks up the trash.
Speaking of going co-ed, what did you think at the time?
I thought it was a darn good idea. Of course, I had been a principal for years, and we're already dealing with this situation. We know that there are schools that will have segregated classes, and they say sometimes that there's less problems. But on the other hand, there is also a financial problem. If you're competing for getting students, you better take. I've always felt that it would raise the academic level a little bit by going co-ed. We have a neighbor whose daughter graduated from the women's college, and she came from California to be part of the protest against going co-ed. And he was talking to me about it, and I said, well, I'm going to tell you, it's a question of the college going under or going co-ed. I said, Marymount was a girls' school, but its main reputation now is its graduate program, not its undergraduate program, and that's because it's a co-ed situation. Their nursing program has men in it, and men are very highly sought out as nurses now. But I said, I think you've got to recognize that colleges today, if they don't go co-ed, they're going to have they better have a big endowment or they're going to have a problem. I don't think alumni had a problem with it. I think, and I couldn't understand why the students were having a problem with it. I would have thought men would have been loved to have had women on the campus.
Well, we've heard some stories from a number of alumni who were very much against it at the time, but you know, they flipped over time, and
Yes.
now they look back and say it's the best thing.
Well, I can tell you a funny little story that took place at one of our old grads, or Boynton Society now, activities. They had for some years when we had some types of meetings here, when there was dormitory space available, they'd offered people, men coming for some type of alumni meeting. Well, if you want a dormitory room, we can give you a dormitory room. Well, this first, I guess, was the first time we came to the meeting, but it was close to 7 or 8 years ago. And Betty says, well, there's no way we're going to stay in a dormitory, because only the seniors would be here. There's no way we're going to stay in a dormitory. We've done that before. And we were at the point economically where we could afford to go to a motel, so that's not a problem. And there was one man, I don't know whether he was a widower or a bachelor or whatnot, but anyway, he had told us the night before he was staying in the dormitory. So we saw him at breakfast. And I said, how was the night? He said, well, I slept. It was reminiscent of being, in a dormitory as a kid. But he said, I woke up in the morning, heard all this talking, and I thought, well, boy, I better get up. Breakfast is at 8 o'clock. And he said, I got my shaving gear, and I walked out into the hall, and here's 3 girls and 2 boys in their underwear talking in the hall. And he said, I sort of walked down the hall like this, and I go into where I knew the bathroom was, and I'm shaving away, and somebody comes in, and I'm shaving, and I turn to say something, and here's a girl washing her face right next to me, and he says, I'm not going to stay in the dormitory anymore. And I said, well, there were private facilities in there, weren't there? And he says, yes, but I wasn't very well dressed. I said, times have changed. Times have changed.
I just have a couple more little quick questions
Okay.
about student life issues. We know from somebody from the 30s that students used to send their laundry home to be done by their mothers.
Yes.
Did you guys still do that?
We had a big, hard box, which was about 6 inches tall, about maybe a yard or so by 1.5 feet, and had a strap around it, and a little place where a card goes into it for the address and the postage. Mostly, anybody that was a GI or had been at a summer camp washed their underwear and socks out in the bathroom. They had these what we would call custodian sinks, deep sinks, and you could just get laundry detergent and wash those out. And basically, you didn't have a lot of other clothes, so you just wore what you had till you had a chance to go home. Sheets, I guess since we took a lot of showers, we didn't worry about changing our sheets too often, but probably when you went home on various Thanksgiving, maybe, Christmas, spring, I don't know whether we had spring breaks in those days, but anyway, probably 3 times a year you would carry your laundry home, but you would have extra sheets and things. But we did mail occasionally. It wasn't very expensive to mail at home. But I can remember that hard box, yes. We did do that. We didn't use commercial laundries, and we didn't have laundry facilities on campus, which is different today. Yeah.
Did you and your classmates study in the library much? Or not?
The beauty of living in the fraternity house, believe it or not, was it was quiet. There were only
Not anymore.
Not anymore. I hadn't mentioned this, but one of the advantages to coming to college in '46 was we had the GIs coming back. They had missed up to 3 years of their life. They were very serious. We did not have wild parties because they were real dampers on that. I have seen a freshman going out into a snowbank head first because he cut up at somebody's fraternity house. They didn't tolerate. A lot of them were married and lived in a half a Quonset hut down where the apartment type dormitories are now. The fraternity house was their living room, and they were married. They would bring their wife up on a Saturday evening to play music and dance and just to enjoy. They might have a drink, but it was very controlled. And they didn't want a sloppy freshman creating a problem. It was much of a damper on those type of things. Plus the druggist, Dr. Marshall, was one of our I don't know what we call them, sponsors or anything now. And Dr. Bollington and let's see, the guy that went to, I mentioned it, down to Virginia, down at Norfolk. The president down Lambeth. I had a mental loss there. Lambeth, they would come to our activities when we would have a evening activity or something. Dr. Miller, the chemistry professor, was between 2 fraternity houses, so you didn't get too rambunctious, but it was, I think the maturity level of those people put a real I don't think it was a damper, but it was a control factor. We were able to go through that silly stage with the influence of people who were a lot more serious about life. They just didn't have the interest in immaturity, which was good for me, being as young as I was when I came to school. And I think that's a disadvantage for some of the young people today. They come from a larger high school situation, which should make them a lot more mature, but they come to an independence of a college life, and it's a big adjustment for a lot of them.
And one of the things we point out with the fraternities now is advisors are not welcome at the events, and there are not the opportunities to role model the responsible behavior that we had role modeled for us. And it's not the fraternities that are not welcoming the advisors at events, but the liability issues that opens for the college.
Yeah. Yes.
That we.
It's unfortunate that so much of that has entered into the picture, because I think in one respect of responsibility for our own actions, we were more mature in those days. I think from the exposure, we were a lot less mature, but I'm not sure which is the better on that respect. We were totally brought up in an era where whatever you do, you're responsible for it. My father's comment always was, if you have to go to court, I'll have to be there, but I'll be one step behind you. I will never be in front of you in a court. And nobody would have thought about getting a lawyer. I mean, your parents got to be there, but getting a lawyer? That was just not done. We used the library for research. And when, I don't know, did they still do a senior project type of thing or a major paper?
No.
See, that had come in with the curriculum when I was here. You picked a topic supposedly in your junior year, and you started your research. And this was a 6-credit project.
It was a big deal.
And you had an advisory panel, and you spent a whole year working on it. I did, of course, a historical study of Henry Esmond, reflecting the history of the time. Probably very amateurish, but I had to do a lot of reading of the parallel history to the story. And I had one friend who was a foreign language student. He didn't spend 2 years on his. He spent about 3 months. But he wrote about the French influence on a Spanish writer. It was all in French and Spanish. And there was only one person on his committee that could read it. But we did use that, and I learned to use the Library of Congress, because I went up to the Library of Congress several times to do some research on that. In those days, you could really get books very easily at the Library of Congress. And so it helped when I was working on my dissertation that I had the experience of being up there. The library, though, was the only quiet place. But we usually went down in, we called it the dungeons, down in the stacks, which I believe were in the basement, if I'm not mistaken, in those days. And there were little cubicles, little desks and chairs in among the books, so you could find a quiet spot. But we didn't have, after you got people past that freshman business, you didn't have, I think, and yet I was only in the dormitory 1 year, so I couldn't speak. But the residents, the RAs, kept a pretty tight on it. And the guys that created the problem usually left after the first semester in the dormitories. They really didn't make it past that.
I just have one last question. You belong to the YMCA. Did the YMCA have its cabin at that point, and do you recall where it was? If they did?
I think that we used something in the old chapel area down in that Sunday school section. As I recall, there was some ping pong tables and some things, some recreational things in there. And I have a very faint recollection of playing an awful lot of ping
The
pong.
Sunday school building,
I haven't seen anything.
well, it's gone. It was
Yeah.
an addition on the building, and it's gone.
It's
and
where
it had
that
a rec
patio
room.
or something is there now. And there was a lot of classrooms there. I had a lot of our classes. But then they started building little temporary buildings over here for classes. Hot, I can remember that. We had another little system I would just mention, and I know you're not watching. We had paid telephones in the fraternity houses. That's the only type of telephone you had on campus, were paid telephone. And when there was an away football game, somebody would call back to that number. And when you answered it, it would be, I want to speak to Ted York in 13-14. And that meant you lost by 1 point the football game. Or if it was room 14 to 13, it meant you won.
That's so funny.
That's great.
Sorry, he's not here right now.
That's funny.
I told you I could talk forever, so you have to.
Well, we appreciate you coming, and
uh.
we've learned a lot. It's been very fun. So thank you for coming and
Yeah.
sharing with us and sharing about the York Scholarship Fund as
Good.
well.
Thank you.